Godfather just turned 50 years old, and I've only got one question. Is The Godfather overrated? The Francis Ford Coppola movie, The Godfather, based on a Mario Puzo book of the same name, which I actually have right behind me. That movie turns 50 years old right now. And I had the pleasure of going to see it in IMAX for the very first time just yesterday. The story of an aging patriarch of an organized crime dynasty in post-war New York City transfers control of his clandestine empire to his reluctant youngest son. That's the very, very short synopsis of The Godfather on IMDb. And that's definitely one of the most briefest synopsises of the movie you can put out there, because this movie has so many elements to it. Aside from the amazing cast, which includes the likes of Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, Diane Keaton, Robert Duvall, James Caan, I could keep going. I think the strength of that cast is really shown by the fact that 50 years later, many of those actors are now considered iconic actors. The Godfather is considered by many to be one of the greatest mafia movies, gangster movies, and greatest movies of all time. The story ebbs and flows throughout the movie spectacularly. The pacing of the movie goes up and down, but every time you think the movie is dipping down and slowing down a little bit, something explosive or something just insane to the story happens. The movie is filled with iconic lines, iconic scenes, and even an iconic theme song. The main song throughout the movie, the Godfather theme song, flows throughout the movie. There's different variations of it, and it's a fairly simple score overall. It's not overdone. It's not a Hans Zimmer type of big epic thing that's almost as big as the movie. The song itself is very simple, just works so well to set the tone throughout the movie. And for such a simple score, has arguably become the most iconic movie score of all time. Because even mentioning the Godfather theme song, it starts playing in your head, doesn't it? A little bit, you start hearing the song in the background. Now, if you've been on my channel before, when I talk about movies, when I talk about good movies, in particular Oscar-winning movies, I always mention these movies have that one big scene that sticks with you. And I often say great movies have 3 to 4 really, really strong scenes. Well, the thing with The Godfather is it's got about 10 to 12, maybe even 15 really, really good scenes. Whether it's scenes that make you angry, scenes that make you cry, or scenes that make you say, wow, this movie has the lot. And on top of all of that, you've got so many big characters in one movie. Something that a lot of movies fail with in modern day, having so many characters, trying to get them all relevance and all screen time and make them all relevant within one movie. It's very hard to do. But in this movie, you've got the Godfather himself, who straight away in the opening scene, it's very evident what an important man he is and how decisive he is and how much power he has.
What have I ever done to make you treat me so disrespectfully? If you'd come to me in friendship, then the scum that ruined your daughter would be suffering this very day. And if by chance an honest man like yourself should make enemies, then he would become my enemies. And then they would fear you.
You're also introduced to the likes of Tom Hagen, and you see his relevance. You're told his relevance, his relationship to the Godfather, and you see this is an important man. We're introduced to Sonny in the movie, the next in line in the Corleone movie, a man who cares for his family, but also a tough, aggressive man. Not as business orientated as Tom or considered as Tom, certainly the more aggressive of the Corleone sons. And then there's Michael, the kind of almost black sheep of the family at the beginning. He's different than everyone else. He's a war veteran. He's more considered, he's more on the outside of things at the beginning. He seems shyer at the beginning. And he even says himself, that's my family, that's not me. We'll get into Michael a little later on in the video. But on top of that, you have all the other characters that are introduced. You've got Luca Brasi right at the beginning. He's introduced a little bit of a, buffoon gangster kind of, lower down henchman type of deal.
Don Corleone, I am honored and grateful that you have invited me to your daughter's wedding. On the day of your daughter's wedding,
But his character is very much established very strongly at the beginning that the Godfather has a lot of trust in him and he is his right-hand man to do things for him. Maybe not right-hand man, but certainly someone he trusts to get the job done in certain aspects. All the way through the movie, we're introduced to so many characters and they all have relevance, they all have a payoff, and ultimately all more or less get a comeuppance in some shape or form in the movie. And it's amazing that that's done within this movie because so many movies struggle to do that, to make every character in the movie relevant. I watched the movie just last night in IMAX in the cinema for the 50th anniversary. I went to go see it with my brother, and afterwards we were talking about the movie for so long. We're talking about the scenes that we loved in it. And the scene with the horse's head, it's so iconic, but it's so early in the movie that it felt so long since we'd watched that scene because we'd watched everything else in the movie, and there's so many other big scenes. You've got the scene, there's going to be spoilers alert if you haven't seen The Godfather. Number one, you're insane. You need to go see that immediately. But if you haven't seen it, there will be spoilers here. But scenes like when the Godfather gets shot down, it's so shocking at the time. When Sonny gets killed, the way that scene is put together, the way it's built up to, it's insane. The Godfather Part 1 has so much to it that I believe if this movie was made today, modern day, it would probably be like Disney making it because, you know, they own everything, not because Disney make gangster movies. But let's just say it was being made modern day. I think Godfather Part 1 alone would be stretched out to a trilogy because there's enough in it to make a trilogy. So much happens within the movie, you could easily see them stretching this out like they did with The Hobbit, because, you know, that could have been one spectacular movie. They stretched it out to 3 okay movies. But The Godfather clearly didn't have those struggles they have today of the studio demanding to get the most out of that one series. Francis Ford Coppola had the wherewithal to combine it all into one spectacular movie. And the movie at the beginning, it ebbs and flows so well. There's scenes that flow into each other fantastically. For example, there's a scene where the Godfather's having a meeting with all the guys, telling them what they want, and at the end of it he says, "Send in Luca Brasi." As soon as the door closes, Luca just pops up in the scene because the way the edit was done, it just flowed really well. There's a scene after the Godfather is shot where Michael's in New York and he goes on a phone call. That's a weird saying. He takes a phone call where he's talking to Sonny. As soon as he hangs up the phone, we pick up the movie from Sonny putting the phone down. And that flow is really, really good. The edit is really, really strong. Later on in the movie, there's big time jumps because Michael comes back from Sicily, then Diane Keaton sees him and he's like, "Oh, it's been a year, I've been back a year." Then the next time we see them together, they have a kid. Then the next time we see them, the kid's like 3 or 4. So there is big time jumps towards the end. You can kind of see where there was more than likely an original cut that was much, much longer. I'd say possibly even like 6-7 hours long, and they had to cut out big chunks, but it works so well. That's the thing with the movie, there's no filler in there, there's no scenes just to take up time. The pacing, as I mentioned earlier, it's very, very strong, and that's one of the key things with the movie. One of the things I really like about The Godfather is there's no mega effects. There's no mega special effects. There's no mega camera work like big swooping pans, drone shots. There's nothing to take away from the story. The Godfather is considered one of the greatest movies of all time because it's one of the best told stories of all time. And that's just it with The Godfather. Why it's beloved is because it's a story that's told so well. It's such an intricate story. It's got so much to it. So much happens. It's not following a very basic structure that a lot of movies follow now. It's got its own tone. It's got its own structure. It's so well told. It keeps you engaged. And even at the moments when you think it's about to get slow, it's slowing down a little bit because it is a 3-hour movie. The movie surprises you. It takes a left turn, it takes a right turn, it goes up, it explodes, someone gets killed. A perfect example, I already mentioned the scene when Sonny gets killed. Just before that, there's a blood-boiling scene when Carlo beats up his wife, who is Sonny's sister. And Sonny has already attacked Carlo, including a scene where he clearly misses the punch. But Sonny is livid. He hops in his car, he drives off, he's going to go kill Karl. That's what they clearly make it seem like it's going to happen. And spoiler alert here if you haven't seen it, of course. He pulls up to the toll booth and something goes wrong. The guys all pop up, they all shoot him. For some reason, some random fella kicks him in the face as well. I guess he wanted his moment in the sun. But the scene is so brilliantly set up because as an audience member for the very first time seeing that movie, there is no possible way you see that coming. There is no way. It's just sensationally set up, and that's not the only time something like that happens in the movie, where you think the movie's going one direction and they go completely a different way. And it's not just a random thing that happens, it makes sense to the story, and you're led down a path by the filmmakers brilliantly, and then they just completely shock you. And it's something that they don't do in movies enough nowadays. A lot of times you can tell what's going to happen in a movie before it happens. And a couple of times they do try to do a misdirect, it's often very, very obvious that's going to happen. M. Night Shyamalan does it a lot, and you know it's going to happen. The thing I noticed yesterday in particular, because it's been about, I'd say it's possibly been 10 years since I watched The Godfather. Sometimes you just have to leave a movie and forget about it as much as possible and go back and try and enjoy it like it was the first time again. And that's definitely the case with The Godfather now, because I went to see it in IMAX, as I mentioned. I loved the fact I got to see it in the cinema. I wasn't a big fan of IMAX in itself. I don't see what it adds to older movies like that, because it's hard to add too much into it. And the cool thing was there was a lot of parents bringing their kids, bringing a new generation, not kids, but you know, older kids like teenagers and older teenagers to go see it clearly for the very first time. And I can only imagine how cool it must be to see The Godfather for the very first time that you're watching it in a movie theater. Because I saw it on like a crappy small TV on DVD years ago, but I still absolutely loved it because the movie just grabs you. It keeps your attention all the way through, and it's fantastically told, as I mentioned. But as I was alluding to, one thing that shows you how good this movie is, it's something I spotted when I was watching it in the theater, is the influences it clearly had on some of the most iconic filmmakers that we know today. You can look at this movie and see where the likes of Spielberg and Scorsese have clearly taken influence from this movie. For example, there's a scene with Apollonia, Michael's wife, in Sicily, when her car explodes unexpectedly. Very similar to Martin Scorsese's Casino, the opening scene in that where Robert De Niro gets in his car and it unexpectedly explodes in a phenomenal opening scene. It's a very similar scene in The Godfather, and you can see where Scorsese could possibly look at that and see how cool that scene was and how unexpected it was and how it throws off an audience and influenced that into his own work. Similar, there's a scene where Diane Keaton's character goes to the Corleone compound looking for Michael, and she wants Tom to take a letter. Everyone's wearing black and grey, overalls, duller tones, and along comes Kay, dressed all in red. Clearly stands out, clearly she doesn't belong, and it's a very good visual, which Spielberg has done multiple times. You can even make the direct comparison to the girl in red in Schindler's List, and that's just a few examples. There's various instances throughout this movie you can look at and say, clearly this director took something from that movie. And I think so many directors, possibly all of the great directors, have looked at The Godfather and taken some influence from it. And that speaks volumes of how good that movie is, that influenced so many of the biggest big directors out there. And if you're a filmmaker yourself, you need to study that movie and just see how they made such an amazing movie without major effects, without major camera work, without the best of visuals, because there is parts in the movie, even restored, that don't look spectacular, especially establishing shots and certain wide shots. They don't look spectacular. There's no big camera movements or anything like that, as I mentioned. It's just purely good casting, good acting, and phenomenal storytelling that carries this movie all the way through. An interesting little fact I learned when I was in Hollywood land myself one time in Paramount Studios, standing outside the studio that was used to shoot The Godfather, is that the Cosa Nostra, actual mafia members, were constantly on set because they had invested involvement in the movie. Not necessarily financial, but they were just kind of, sick of seeing bad representations of themselves on screen, and they wanted the movie to be as authentic as possible. And I think that just adds an extra layer of cool to the movie. And then on top of the unbelievable cast, the phenomenal storytelling, the twists and turns everywhere, you've got Michael Corleone, who starts out the movie as a very, very shy, not shy, but as I mentioned, the black sheep of the family, the more outside person. And slowly throughout the movie, he grows in importance. He's got big moments, like when he shoots down the guy from the Tattaglia family and the police chief. His character just grows throughout the movie immensely. Perhaps one of the greatest character arcs of all movies. And it's one that everybody who makes a movie should look at and try to develop their characters like that. Because a little bit of pressure is taken off them in that the Godfather is there as the established main character at the beginning. And slowly there's a transition of power from the actors, let alone the characters, where by the end, Al Pacino is now the main guy instead of Marlon Brando. The slow build of Michael's character throughout the movie, the growth of his character, you don't see that in any modern day movies now. Generally, people start out, you get their origin story, and then they get bitten by a spider, and then they're Spider-Man. There you go. Or you get some guy and he suddenly finds out he's got this power, and then that's his whole thing. He wasn't powerful at the start and now he is powerful. There's a shy guy at the beginning of the movie, and at the end of the movie he gets the girl. You know, the character arcs aren't great anymore. Michael Corleone's character arc is one of the greatest in cinema history. So add that on top of the great cast, the great storytelling, the great twists and turns throughout. And I come back to my initial question, is The Godfather overrated? Even 50 years later, no. It's one of the greatest movies ever made. And I don't know if that's a sad state of affairs that even 50 years later, we're still looking back at this movie as one of the greatest ever, because nothing can do better, apart from Godfather Part 2. But it really shows the filmmakers need to up their games. They need to get on the level of The Godfather. Will there ever be a point where we look back on The Godfather and say, that's kind of outdated now? It does happen to movies. It does happen where some movies used to be great and then they don't hold up. The Godfather, even 50 years later, it still holds up. It's still one of the greatest movies of all time. Top 5 guaranteed for most people. I think I put it number 7 in my top 100 movies. But with all that being said, if you have not seen The Godfather, even if you just haven't seen it in a long, long time, go watch The Godfather. You won't be disappointed.